Olá, sejam muito bem-vindos. Eu sou o Carlos Honorato. Esse é o meu canal de cenários e a gente vai apresentar agora uma palestra seminal aqui, que é seminal no sentido de original, fundamental, primordial, inicial, sobre a lógica de cenários futuros. É um documento histórico falando, quem faz essa palestra é o Pierre Wack, no comecinho dos anos 70, e vocês vão observar ali que ainda estão usando o retroprojetor, que é alguma coisa que as pessoas mais antigas, mais dinossáuricas, devem conhecer. Então aproveitem, o vídeo não tem aquela qualidade maravilhosa, mas ali estão todos os princípios do que é cenário planning. Em breve a gente vai traduzir isso, vai fazer uma atualização dessas informações para os dias de hoje, mas eu acho que vale como um documento histórico entender ali quem são os fundadores aí da lógica de cenário planning. Boa palestra para vocês.
Don't think that oil or chemical companies are particularly bad at making forecasts. I would like to show you now the performance of the most brilliant team of economists. Certainly no company could afford a team of economists of such a quality. Probably no single government could do so. It is a team of OECD economists, which, as you know, twice a year make projection of the rate of increase of gross national product of their member country. And there are two very important lessons which I would like to draw from this. The forecast is in red and the reality is in black. It's the forecast which is published in December for next year. So it's made in October. It's the ideal case for next year where everything practically is played out. Two important observations. Look, most of the time, forecasts are quite good. And this is what makes forecasts so dangerous. If forecasts would be always wrong, you would really get rid of forecasts. But most of the time, forecasts work, except for Italy, where you see forecasts never work. And this is only the official economy. The danger of forecasts is that usually they are right. Forecasts are based on the tacit assumption that the world will basically remain the same as it was. And the world does not always change, therefore, quite often forecasts work. But my second point is the following. Forecasts fail you just where you would need them most. Forecasts fail to anticipate major changes, major shifts in the business environment. Shifts that make whole strategies obsolete. There, forecasts fail you. And in forecasting, in economic or business forecasting, it is very similar to weather forecasting. The real value of forecasting is to anticipate stormy changes. If you anticipate just business as usual, the value of forecast is very little. I like to collect little pieces of wisdom because from experience, I know now that the most important ingredient in planning is not econometrics. It's not technological forecasting. It's not system analysis. It is wisdom. This is an Arab proverb which says in one sentence more than I could say in half an hour. Those who foretell the future lie, even if they tell the truth. Even if they tell the truth. The most dangerous forecasters are those who have just been right. Because most probably they have been right for the wrong reason, and you are tempted to believe them. Have a look at these two charts, which are specially addressed at energy people, at oil people. This was our traditional world of more of the same, an extraordinarily stable world, where you see oil consumption has multiplied by 7 in less than 30 years. A world of stability, of practical predictability, where you could reasonably make forecasts. Now this is our new world. where you see first growth is stopped and we finish at a lower level than we started 15 years ago. And there is great temptation for managers who have formed their skill during this rather stable period to use the same skill in this period. And this is dramatic. I would like to suggest that we need to develop new skills to plan in a turbulent environment. And strategic planning is now much more an art for which you require a discipline. And this discipline is made out of 5 skills. And each of these 5 skills, you can really increase quite substantially your proficiency. I will develop later on the scenario part. But strategic vision is a key part of this approach. I derived most of the things I know about strategic vision from Japan. A Japanese company smile at Western company when they see our type of planning, and they don't believe in it. They say, we just have, and they say it with a smile of satisfaction, a clear vision of what type of company we want to be. An investment is doing, divesting is doing. What you want to be as a company is upstream of this. Then you have option planning. Most planning present their strategy on a single line. And a single line strategy is even more dangerous than single line forecasting. And when there are options, in most cases, they are straw man. They are not real options. They are artificial options, which are put forward in order to, as a way of convincing managers to get to the preferred strategy. Option planning is an approach by which you insist that all the options are put forward on a neutral, non-advocative mode. Competitive positioning is something which is quite well known in a number of other branches, but was poorly developed in energy and oil company because they didn't need it. These 4 are of a different nature than this one. This is like census to find your way in this new turbulent environment. You remember the lower part of the chart as opposed to the higher part of the stable environment. This, on the contrary, is energy to get it done. It's very important, sequential consensus building. You need to have fire. You need to have motivation to do this type of planning. And you need to have it sequentially. I will develop a little bit more scenario. I started by saying that it is foolish to try to forecast the future. At the same time, an oil company needs to form a clear view of the future. There are few industries where the need is so high. Look, I'm not a fanatic of planning. You only need planning when the speed of change of the business environment is faster than your own speed of reaction. If you can react quickly, you don't need planning. I met recently the man in charge of planning for the Deutsche Wehrmacht, or what has succeeded to the Wehrmacht, and they plan for everything 15 years ahead. This is a monster. It's a type of thing what not to do. But in oil, we have to plan because most of our investments are front-end loaded, and most of our returns come far ahead. So we need to form a clear view of the future. How do I reconcile the fact that it is foolish to try to forecast the future and the fact with the other fact that an oil company needs to form a clear view of the future? This will be largely the topic of my talk. I should qualify what I said. It is impossible to forecast the future unless it is predetermined. The concept of predetermined is so essential, so fundamental in our approach that I would like to take a comparison to be sure to put my point across. Would you remember having seen at your television screen 3 years ago heavy floods in India, which killed hundreds of people around the Ganges? I happen to know the Ganges pretty well, from spring to Mars. It's an extraordinary river. Once you have seen it, you don't forget it. If you see heavy monsoon rains at the upper part of the Ganges, you can anticipate with certainty that within 2 days, something extraordinary is going to happen at Rishikesh, which is at the foothill of the Himalayas. And then 4 days later in Allahabad, northeast of Delhi. And again, 2-3 days later in Benares. This is not fortune telling. This is not crystal ball gazing. This is merely describing future implication of something which has already happened. And the first thing we do in scenario planning is to identify predetermined elements. And there are always predetermined elements in a situation. But let me stress, the most important are not the obvious predetermined. They are the system predetermined. I'm going to give you some example later. I would like to stress, this is a painstaking exercise. Sometimes people used to associate scenario planning with a kind of brainstorming exercise of the imagination. No, the first starting point, the foundation of scenario are predetermined elements. Let me quote you another little piece of my wisdom collection. It's in French, I'm going to translate it, but I will first start in French, it's so much clearer. Un fait mal observé est plus pernicieux qu'un mauvais raisonnement. A poorly observed fact is more treacherous than wrong reasoning. From my experience, most of the errors in future-oriented study do not come from wrong reasoning. They come from poorly, insufficiently observed facts. Let me give you another example. When we used to hire a new member of our planning team, needless to say, we tried to co-opt a smart one. Let's suppose we took someone from one of our lab. Usually, we had to go through a whole process of changing its value. Would you not agree with me that most of us have been trained to be original, to say things that nobody said before us, and using words that nobody used before us? Originality is a pernicious value in future-oriented study. Because if you are for originality, then you tend to be fascinated by the 2 or 3 things which you have discovered, and you lose the picture of the whole. In all modesty, only excellence is just good enough. Then usually originality follows from this. So the first thing we try to do is to identify predetermined elements, and I'm going to give you some examples. And every situation contains its share of predetermined elements, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. But in most of the cases, a situation is not largely enough predetermined that you could come with a single line forecast. And let me make this point very strongly. A single line forecast on a situation which is not 99% predetermined is an intellectual swindle. The final decision maker, when he faces an uncertain type of decision, and there are such decisions, he has the right to know how uncertain it is. He must not have the dangerous impression that he takes a kind of safe, business as usual type of decision. Therefore, to cope with the uncertain part of the business environment, we have tried to gain know-how, to accumulate know-how and experience in the use of scenario. Scenario is a very popular word now. It's difficult to spend half an hour with any planner without him using the word scenario. We use scenario in a variety of senses. We use first-generation scenario, exploratory scenario, archetype scenario, decision scenario. When I was at Harvard, I saw a number of companies telling me around the same story. We understand that at Shell you have used scenario and you were satisfied. We also use scenario. And then the story which follows are variation on the same theme. Either our manager asked very strongly, which is the most likely of your scenario? Or the discussion was frustrating and was adjourned at next month, and next month never came. Let me give you a few examples of what scenarios are not. These are drilling scenarios, which were made by a friend of mine for a very serious company. And it's really a textbook example of what scenario should not be. First, by design, never have this type of design, where you have three scenarios, a variation around the same theme, because then people will choose the middle one as a main, as a kind of baseline, and just the two extreme as a kind of high and low. And you lose totally the advantage of a scenario approach. But also from a content point of view, it is a caricature of scenario. He was an economist, and an honest economist. And economists know very well that there are outside events which can influence their projection. So scenario one was a scenario where the context was quite favorable. For instance, economic growth was quite high, demand for oil product was increasing. You would find really bonanza, which generate a certain enthusiasm in the profession. While scenario three was just the contrary. You had an adverse fiscal system, no bonanza, on the contrary, disappointing finding, and scenario two was something in between. In other terms, the focus was on the outcome. Now, let me show you reality, and you see why. Real scenarios are really based on an understanding of the force who drives the system, on the forces behind this outcome. These are three forecasts. These are not at all scenarios. For instance, on top of the normal drilling activity of oil company, you had a speculative drilling activity fueled by dentists and doctors at the time where inflation was still very high. Capital cost was low and you get tax exemption. When each of these three elements change, obviously the speculative activity collapsed. Other element he had not taken into account. In 1980, for instance, everybody was anticipating that the price of oil would increase forever. And you get not this change of perception. This type of three different outcomes in three different contexts is a caricature of what really scenario should be. Scenario should give you a better understanding of the force who drives the system. I would like now to draw on my own experience of what scenario should not be, to introduce a very important notion, which is a notion of first generation scenario. When we developed the first scenarios in Shell in '71, which are described in more detail in the first of the Harvard Business Review article, we started with a surprise-free scenario. This is the implicit view that managers have spontaneously. In my opinion, in my experience, this never happens now. But it's very, very critical to have it in your package. Because if all the scenarios are foreign to the view, the spontaneous view of managers, the whole process will look threatening. Scenario 2 and 3 were combining in opposite proportion the two obvious uncertainty we had discovered in our business environment, which was the level of host government take and the level of economic growth. Scenario 2 was a very high increase in host government take and in price of oil. And in this case, you could have only a lower demand for oil than in the surprise-free scenario. While scenario 3 was just the contrary. I'm sure you don't remember, but 1970 and 71 were years of very low economic growth, way below average. And we extrapolated this and we said, suppose this type of world continues with a change of value, the me first type of value which came apparent in the late 60s. In such a background, you could have only a lower increase of forced government take compared to the surprise-free scenario. And finally, scenario 4 was a scenario full of other energy, full of coal or nuclear at the expense of oil. Here was a scenario in volume. You see here the total demand in scenario, energy demand in surprise-free scenario. This is how it was supplied. Scenario 2, you have a lower demand because you have a high price increase. And scenario 3, you have a very, very low demand. It's a gloomy, very low economic growth type of demand. And here you had the evolution of the fourth scenario in terms of prices. This was a surprise-free evolution of price where at the renegotiation of the Tehran agreement, you would have an increase of the tax by slightly more than $1. You see, scenario 2 was a very high increase in taxation, up to nearly $5 in 1970, which makes some $8 in 1973 money. While on the contrary, in the gloomy, low economic growth scenario 3, it was even lower as increase than in the surprise-free scenario. What I want to stress, these four scenarios are really textbook scenarios. What normal textbook tell you that scenario should be. They explored a very wide span of the possible future, and each scenario was really consistent. I showed you here just a few figures, but they were fully developed and fully consistent. When I showed this scenario to our managing directors, I could not see the beginning of a sparkle of interest in their eyes. Not the beginning of a spark. There were 7 managing directors. 3 of them were actively looking for a different system from our mechanical traditional unified planning machinery. The other 4 were rather indifferent. Even in these 3, I could see no interest at all. Why? For a very clear reason. On those type of scenario, you cannot take any decision. What does it help you? If you would know in which scenario you are, then you could take decision. But these 4 scenarios, you are just confused at a higher level of sophistication. And many, many companies, when they want to go scenario planning, go to this level, and then the whole process stops because management is frustrated. Now, what is quite extraordinary, the planner who showed me, who talked me about their experience in their company, usually added, it's probably because our management team is not really capable of dealing with uncertainty. How arrogant from planners. Let me stress that the managing director to which we showed this had, compared to normal management team, an exceptional experience of dealing with uncertainty. A great proportion of the decisions they take deal with exploration, with drilling in new fields. And unless you drill, you do not know what you will find. Now, why is it that the same people find even at ease to decide, should I invest $50 million Northwest Australia versus $40 million in the North Sea? Why is it that they can face this type of uncertainty while they are paralyzed and frustrated against this type of uncertainty? It's very important to see the difference. Look, when they have to decide if they are going to commit a certain number of millions to explore in a certain part of the world, they have a lot of geological analysis on which to base their judgment, geophysical analysis. They can make comparison with this prospect with other prospects. In other terms, they can exercise their judgment. My experience is that managers of large, well-managed company, I mean the top manager, have been lifted to their jobs largely because of their good judgment. And they know it. And they identify with this quality. And when they cannot exercise their judgment, they are really frustrated. And they adjourn the session and they do not want to know anything about scenario. And this type of scenario does not permit them to exercise their judgment. Now, as you well know, and has been described in the first article of Harvard Business Review, we used this first generation exploratory scenario to put on stream some of our study and to discover predetermined elements. For instance, this was a triangle study through which we tried to understand what might be the behavior of the major actors on the energy scene, which are producer country, oil-consuming country, and oil company. And if you look at the article, you will see how we could anticipate, for instance, that Iran would suddenly switch its strategy from trying to increase its volume, and we went under heavy pressure in 71, 72, to increase our liftings in the consortium from Iran at the same rhythm that Aramco did from Saudi Arabia. In other terms, thanks to this exploratory scenario, we discovered far more predetermined elements. And we really could come with another generation of scenario, which are not yet decision scenario. It was our first experience. These scenarios are still clumsy. First, 6 scenario is much too much. It's much too much. The ideal number of scenario is 3. The surprise-free scenario plus, and you show explicitly how fragile it is and why it is fragile. If you cannot show it, then you do not need scenarios. Usually you can show it. And then you have 2 real scenarios, which put light on the key critical uncertainty. 6 scenario is far too much. What is a scenario? It is not merely an alternative future. It is not merely the price of oil could be $40 or could be $10. This is useless. Or a sensitivity test, you know, a baseline with a high and a low. Or an interesting story of what could happen in the future. The emphasis is really on understanding how and why a situation develops. When I had scenario presentation in Shell, usually the presentation lasted 3 hours. 4/5 of the time was spent on analyzing the force to drive the scenario. And the scenarios themselves could be exposed in 20 minutes. The key element was really understanding the force who were behind the outcome on which the scenario were focusing. It contains all the predetermined elements. I cannot stress it enough. Scenario is basically identifying the predetermined element. And only afterwards, you go to the imaginatory activity. It's not at all a type of brainstorming a la Herman Kahn. And when I mean all the predetermined element, I mean in 2 directions. First, most of the plan I have seen take into account 3 basic driving forces for change in the business environment, which are very important. Demographic change, economic change, and technological change. And if you analyze them well, you can derive a lot of implication. You can derive future supply, future demand, many times future cost, and often future prices. A Japanese company would devote more time to analyze competition than to analyze the business environment. Then you have political change. And again, the first article of Harvard Business Review illustrates how we analyzed producer country strategy and consumer country reaction in terms of their energy policy. And then you have, finally, the softest part of the business environment, change in value. The point I want to suggest is the following. In an oil company, it's not too difficult to get the attention of your audience when you deal with this part of the business environment, because here you can speak hard facts, while here it's much more soft. But in many occasions, the real surprises came from this side of the business environment. Remember Singapore during the last war. Singapore was a fortress which was admirably defended towards the sea. Everybody who came to Singapore came by boat. And it was manned by people from the Navy. And towards the sea, every angle was really covered. If you read the fascinating history of Singapore during the war, a few people were well aware that there was a jungle site. And they had even suggested what to do on the jungle site. But they were asked to keep quiet because there were no sophisticated complex to deal with the jungle site. What was needed there was barrels of oil to put on flame, you know, the little piece of water between the peninsula and the soil. This was, but no way as sophisticated as towards the seaside. And we know all what happened, that the real danger came from the jungle side. Similarly, would you not agree with me that the study of the future energy in 1971, 72, 73, which would have been professionally extremely competent on this side of the business environment, but which would have missed this, would have been just naive and irrelevant. Similarly, I would suggest that in many ways, in the future, study who would meet this part, but would be professionally competent on this part, would be equally naive and irrelevant. Scenario must contain all the predetermined elements on another dimension. This is a slightly pedantic chart that I used with my students at Harvard. There are 4 categories of predetermined elements. Elements which are already in the pipeline. For instance, the minimum miles per gallon for cars is an institution predetermined element, which is already in the pipeline. Then you have interrelated elements. These are the most important. System predetermined, that you find only when you dig in your system. For instance, that when Iran would continue to produce, they would discover that their rate of depletion would drastically diminish, and they would change their strategy. Then you have slowly changing elements. I take it for predetermined that in the not too distant future, you will have a fully competitive electric car. My friends in Honda told me they want to be the first company to put an effective, clean urban vehicle. I do not know what it will be, but I suppose that it will be electric. Well, still, it will only have a marginal impact on the existing car population. So it's a slowly changing predetermined element. Also, many behavior elements change only slowly at the margin. And lastly, very important, you have the things which are impossible. One of the most useful tasks that scenario achieve is to discard the impossible. In 74, after the first oil shock, we made price scenario, which we did not change. We could live with them for years. And they started by 2 negative conclusions. They said the price of oil will not fall in money of the day. At this time, you remember you had brilliant people, Milton Friedman, Herman Kahn, who said the price of oil will collapse below $3. The Department of Energy was putting a floor price on the price of energy. We told them, forget about it. The price of oil in money, in dollar terms, will not decrease. And the second negative thing, we told them, the price of oil, which would be capable of generating a normal economic development, a serious economic development of alternative energy, will not be high enough to generate this development. Because we used a comparison. It's like if the floor would be higher than the ceiling. The price which would be capable of generating a real development of alternative source of energy would be too high to be economically digested. These two negative parts were some of the most important message of the price scenario. So to discard the impossible is a key ingredient in the scenario. And then you have the genuinely uncertain element. Only a little God could know what happens. And they are critical. For instance, 3 years ago, we had those four elements, which were genuinely uncertain and really critical. And they became the driving force for scenario. And finally, you have the accidental element, but highly significant. For instance, Khomeini will die. It's predetermined. But when he dies, he's totally accidental and highly significant. Don't forget that his brother is 8 years older than he is, and he's better health than Khomeini himself. They analyze interlinkages and the dynamic. They focus on crucial uncertainty, what is really at stake, and here they are internalized. Now, I would like to tackle one of the most important parts of what I have to say on scenario. Either you will think this man is quite weird, or you will find what I'm going to say essential. I'm on the second category. When we presented those scenarios to the second layer in Shell, to what we call coordinator exploration production and their team, coordinator manufacturing and their team, we get an unusual degree of interest. And we had long sessions and even sometimes enthusiasm. People really were quite thrilled by this new approach compared to the previous UPM, which was characterized by an abundance of figures and number crunching. And so they really seemed to like it. And we got naively the impression that they would really act on it. We discovered after 3 months that a very small fraction only of the critical decision makers were really acting on those scenarios. They were capable of generating an intellectual interest, but not really action. Now, I'm sure what I'm going to say now does not apply to your company, but I can tell you it applies in all other companies. Usually, future-oriented studies have a very low effectiveness. In fact, I have difficulty to see any other example of study which have a final effectiveness as low as future-oriented study. And then sometimes a study which is not even good, which is quite mediocre in substance, has an out of proportion effectiveness. The first study of the Club of Rome, you remember the limits to growth, which in my opinion is a very mediocre study, had in fact quite an impact on the views of people. Why is it? What makes the difference between an effective study and a less effective study? I spent quite some time to try to find out, and I would like to develop one major point, which I got very strongly during a sabbatical I spent in Japan. It has to do with basic psychology of decision making. You and your neighbor You have a mental model of the world in which you have to act. This mental model is based on your past experience and on the information you have internalized, you have digested. And when you have a decision to take, you confront different alternatives of behaving with this mental model. And when a man takes good decision, people say of such a man, he has a good judgment. In fact, he has largely a mental model which is a good match of the real world. We call this internalized model microcosm, as opposed to the real world macrocosm. I would like to suggest that unless you change the mental model of a decision maker, nothing is going to change. He may look interested, but his behavior will not be affected. The view of a company has on its business environment is finally maybe more important than its infrastructure of investment. During my sabbatical in Japan, I was working with Nippon Steel, the largest steel company in the world, very well managed. And I knew previously very well a French steel company, Usinor, which is also a very well managed company. And I was astonished that these two companies, operating in exactly the same business environment, were not seeing the same thing. Then the priorities and the strategies they were following directly derived from their perception, from their microcosm. The point I want to make is the following. The purpose of planning is not to produce a document. What will the world of energy look like in 10 years' time? The purpose of planners is to change the mental map of their critical decision maker. Unless this happens, nothing will follow. It will be like water on a stone. Not only do we try to provide high-quality elements for this microcosm, we try also to make it as clear as possible. The difference between a decisive company and a company which is less so is largely that in the first case, the worldview, the mindset is clear, or it is fuzzy. This realization from wanting to produce a document which you will not be ashamed of later, let's say 5 years afterwards, when confronted with reality, which was my first target prior to this experience, with a new target, which was to change the image of reality in the head of the critical decision maker. This is a fundamental switch. It is a revolution in planning, which is as important as when a company switches from selling to marketing. And then, as you well know, we came with totally different picture. Instead of this, we had this type of picture, which is explained in the first article of Harvard Business Review, and this type of picture. To change a mindset, you really speak to the right part of the brain, to the pattern-making part of the brain, not to the analytically oriented part of the brain. And here you have it all. Here are the heavy monsoon rains at the upper part of the Ganges, which in 1972 had already happened. You couldn't stop it. It was that crude oil reserve would be developed now at oil producer country logic, and not anymore at oil company logic. And the fact that you would have a scramble for oil between the 3 major oil importing countries. This had already happened. Plus 4 uniqueness in our industry compared to other industry, you would have this: price increase and insecurity of supply. And then with these 2 routes, you would have this type of evolution. And these 4 arrows were 4 major implications, which were beyond the normal thinking of our managers. You see, this is totally different from the number crunching figure type of approach of normal type of planning. Here is a definition of what scenarios are. And let me stress, scenarios are like cameras. Their power comes by being focused. In the two articles of the Harvard Business Review, I described mainly global scenario, macro scenario. But the real fruits of scenario planning are picked up here, at the mini scenario, at the scenario which are custom tailored around one critical issue or are built around one large project. It is here that the great advantage of scenario planning, you see them. But you cannot develop specific mini scenario unless you have already global scenario. Here is I find a good way to situate scenario planning compared in the present stream of a strategic approach. It's a definition comment which is made by Richard Rummelt. He's professor at the University of California. We invited him to sit at a one-week seminar we had with planners of Shell worldwide, where we were discussing methodology. And after he heard, we asked him to say his impression. I take him out of his impression these things which I find very clear, and I let you read them. This is what you get when you call Boston Consulting Group, Strategic Planning Associates, Bain, Braxton, and so on. Can I show the... I find this last sentence very vital. Let me say the same thing in my own words. Did you finish reading? I find this whole approach a very effective way to rediscover the real power of foresight in a world of uncertainty and change. Let me just pick up a few points. It does not eliminate risk. You just cannot eliminate risk. But it gives you a much better understanding of the risk. And therefore, to your surprise, scenarios who focus on uncertainty and on risk, the result is that managers, contrary to be paralyzed, what you could expect naively, because they understand much better risk, are in fact capable of taking higher risk. It is also an extraordinary tool for reducing complexity. I did not develop this element because it's basically linked with strategic vision and scenario. Coping with complexity, in my opinion, is as vital as dealing with uncertainty. I'm sure you all suffer already today from the overload of information. Unless you do something about it, I can tell you with certainty that in the next 5 years, you're going to suffer even more. Now, this system is a marvelous way to really reduce complexity. And let me briefly say a few words on this, which is very important. It is a process for creativity. Now, let me demystify creativity. Sometimes when you use the word creativity, silence follows, and you expect a strike of lightning. There are two types of creativity. I do not find any convenient word to describe them, but I find my clumsy word will be capable of putting the message across. I use output creativity and input creativity. Picasso would be a good example of output creativity. of outbursting creativity. I'm sure if you have visited an exhibition of Picasso, you have been impressed by the fact that every 6, 7, at the most 8 years, he used to change completely his style. He went from period rose to period bleu to cubism and so on. It is sure that if Picasso would continue to live, he would have invented totally new styles. Picasso dead, nobody would be capable of painting, of creating the type of picture he would have gone on creating. This is outbursting creativity, output creativity. But there is another type of creativity, input creativity. Look, in many fundamental sciences, in many basic technologies, major progress have been achieved by several people in different parts of the planet around the same time by people who had no contact with one another. Why? For a very clear reason. At a certain time, the building blocks on which you exercise your combinatory imagination are available, and then you make the breakthrough. I would like to make the point that this type of approach gives much better quality building blocks for management on which to exercise its judgment and its combinatory imagination. And finally, let me stress this. This type of planning is fun. Compared to the normal number crunching type of planning, the dead religion, the corporate rain dance, this is fun. You don't have to push managers to do it. Once they have tasted it, they don't want anything else. It is certainly more costly in terms of time and effort. It takes much more top management time, undoubtedly. But there is a strange breeder effect. Like in a breeder, it generates more energy than it consumes energy. This is basically what I wanted to say as an introduction. And let me conclude by a last of my proverb. This is a Japanese and Chinese proverb, and it deals with jade. You know, for Chinese, jade is the most polished thing. And the proverb is the following: you can only polish a stone of jade with another stone of jade. But the two stones must come from a different mountain. So, in all modesty, take me as a stone of jade coming up from a different mountain, which you may use to polish your own stone of jades, which I'm sure you have plenty in your pockets.